Okay, now that we got everything cleaned up and ready for reassembly, we're just going to reverse that process. So we can always start with the main piston. The front piston assembly will have to go in first. The outside O-ring. Roll that into place. Going to put a little fusion lube on the O-rings to help with the assembly. Keep our air from drying it off. So I like to actually use an Allen key just to kind of help line that up to get it started. Otherwise it gets to be a bit of a pain. We're going to be careful when we're seating that we don't cut these O-rings. So we're going to go ahead and get the stationary piston. Now that we got the outside O-ring in, we need to work the ID O-ring into the bore. You can use the edge of the screwdriver to make sure that's into the recess. And then I'm going to put the big one on the outer piston. Okay, so we're going to put a little fusion lube, stationary piston, into the sleeve bore. I like to get this on the flat edge of the table. So we got to kind of make sure we get this started straight and not cocked one way or another, or it'll be really difficult. And then we can, with a brass rod or plastic, we just need to get it far enough in to expose the retaining ring groove. There we go. So if it's recessed enough so I can see the groove, so we'll be able to get this ring in. Again, we've got to be mindful that those are aluminum pieces. We're going to just work that ring into the recess. If you can kind of zoom in here, you can see that the ring is actually tucked into the groove, so we know that center wall, center piston is in place and it won't come off the first time that we trigger the gun. So now we can attach the front piston to the rear piston. Use the tool to kind of get it lined up and get the O-ring started into the recess. We're actually going to screw it in hand tight so we see the front piston start to move. Okay, so we're moved. We want to use our 7mm wrench. And again, we just need to snug this up, but we don't want to over tighten it or round off the corners. So now we can replace our air cap. If you look here, we have a 9/16 nut on the cap. This is where we make our piston throw adjustment. So before I put that in, I just like to back it off about 3/4 of a turn. We're going to actually tighten it back in, and I'll show you that adjustment so that we're lining up all the tolerances of these pieces so that the center port is in alignment with the center of the side seal. So put some fusion lube on the threads. Get the cap on. Snug that up. Re-engage the safety. So now we can put the O-rings onto the trigger spool. Okay. A fusion lube on those O-rings. Make sure it stays nice and clean. Push the trigger in all the way. And then we have to add the spring and then the cap. Now this cap actually stays loose. We don't want to screw it in past just flat or maybe a thread in, because the spring tension will hold it in place. If we screw it in too far, then the trigger won't engage properly. So I like to put a little grease in these grooves. Those O-rings tend to come out of place in assembly if we're not careful. So we have the purge air, the internal seal. Okay, so at this point we want to attach our mix chamber. Again, you can see we have the label and we have the size. When I put this back together, I always like to put the size to the top. So then we know that the A stayed with the A, and the B stayed with the B. So I'm just going to rotate that then until the A is at the top. Then we know that they stayed. Make sure those O-rings didn't come off. We're going to put the front end back to the gun. Okay, and from here we're going to have to put the air valve back together. So we want to start with the O-rings. Fusion lube. Okay, so remember this is a check valve assembly. So we actually want the spring in first. Use the screwdriver, kind of line that up to the bore. You can kind of see in there. And we're going to drop the ball on top of the spring, and then we can screw our air valve onto the gun. Tighten that up. Now, we're going to put the air cap and the insert in. Okay, so before I totally do that, when we go to center and adjust that piston throw, couple of things we want to keep in mind. So we're going to have the gun safety off. We're going to put air to the gun and trigger and hold. That'll pull the whole assembly back. And we want to adjust using one of the side seals as a target. We're going to adjust that whole piston throw while it's engaged so that hole is just center or just a little front of center. But the other part of this, when we have the cap on, we want to make sure when the cap comes back, it isn't actually hitting onto the side seal. So if it is, we got to pull it back a little bit from the front to center. So we'll go ahead and get these pieces together so we can do that. We're just going to use the B side seal because it's here. So now this will become our target. So again, I'm going to trigger the gun. This whole works is going to go back. Put that cap on. So what will happen is when the whole works goes back, you see that little port, we're going to put this in here, spin it while it's engaged with air so I know that cap isn't hitting here, and then I'm going to make sure that I can see the impingement port without it being clipped either front or back. So it gets a little loud when I do that, so that's what I'm accomplishing, and I'm just going to adjust this screw forward and back to align that port. You'll be able to see it, but you probably won't hear what I'm saying. Let's go ahead and do that. Air hose back on. It's a 9/16 wrench for that adjustment. We'll attach our air supply. Take the safety off and trigger. See the port going back. Just make sure that port is too far back in the hole. So I'm actually going to adjust this screw forward. Looks about center of the hole. I'm just going to test it again. Hang on to that mix chamber. The side seal. Now that looks good. The hole is centered. It's not clipping on the cap. So we can re-engage the safety and disconnect the air supply. So again, the only time I have to go through that process, if I unstack all those pieces to get the tolerances and everything lined up, or if I change the mix chamber, I should adjust what we call the piston throw. If I'm just taking the normal daily service, cap and insert off, we don't have to readjust that. So let's go ahead and finish putting our gun together. Okay, so the rear retainer, the flat side, bigger flat side goes down, the spring, a little grease on the threads, making sure we get our B side with the B housing and our A side with A housing. So there's the B. That side seal is pushed all the way through. The rear seal, the spring centered, so again, ISO is always to the left when looking at the gun from the rear, so we know that this one will go here. Now when tightening these screws, I like to go back and forth because we're on that spring tension of the side seal. If I just tighten one side or the other, I'm liable to crack the ear off here. So I'll bring one up till it just contact, and then we'll start working it back and forth. We actually want to feel that tension because that lets us know that side seal isn't stuck on the spring. And we'll make that mechanical seal that we talked about. So once it's all the way down, just snug them up. Repeat the process for the resin. Now if we want, if we're going to put this into service or if we're going to put it on our shelf, we can attach our air supply and just give it maybe a shot of grease. Kind of coat all that stuff we had apart so it's not dry the first time we go to use it. And this gun will be ready to go.